Okay, so that was a fun little lesson on American education and why it seems to be so hard to get it right, and how there's really truly no one right way to do education. So what's going to happen right now is a little fun thing that I'm calling videoception. Very fun. Basically what I'm going to do is, in this video, I'm going to analyze the lesson that I taught in the video that I submitted in part 1. Now this is going to be critiqued through the lens of the Peabody conceptual framework. There are 4 aspects of the framework, however I'm only going to be addressing 3 of them. Now let's just say, for the sake of this argument, that my class is the typical class of Albuquerque Public Schools, because that's where I'm from. So the demographics in APS is 67% Hispanic, 21% white, 4% Native American, and 8% other. The first aspect of the conceptual framework is that each teacher should have a very deep knowledge of the subject matter that they're teaching. In Reframing the School Reform Agenda, Linda Darling-Hammond summarizes meaningful learning in the following ways. To foster meaningful learning, teachers must construct experience that allows students to confront power ideas whole. They must create bridges between the very different experiences of individual learners and the common curriculum goals. They must use a variety of approaches to build on the conceptions, cultures, interests, motivation, and learning modes of their students. So the main idea that Hammond is trying to express is that teachers must construct experiences, they must create bridges between different experiences of individual learners and the common curriculum goals, and they must use a variety of approaches to cater to each student. And so what this requires is a tremendous background knowledge of the subject matter in order to convey it in a bunch of different ways so that each student is able to understand the subject matter. In my lesson, I spoke about everything I intended to, but I probably could have taken it a step further by perhaps keeping in mind the experiences that my students have had. Because my class is 88% white and Hispanic, and so if I was able to relate the civil rights activist movement to Hispanic race or white race, or some connection that my students could have, something that pertains to their cultures, they maybe could have received the knowledge better. But essentially what I know is what I conveyed, so I was unable to express this in very many ways because I am not yet a master in education. I think a common pitfall pertaining to the knowledge of a subject area is described in building a teaching community, which is a dialogue between Ron Scapp, who is a white teacher in a rural area, and Bell Hook, who is a black teacher in an urban area. In this, they address that professors often don't question their method of teaching because they associate that with their identity and can't stand the thought of having a wrong idea. Oftentimes a lecturer will lecture the way I just did, and they'll be completely okay with that because they believe that they know such superfluous amount that they don't need to analyze the way that they teach, which is not true. The root of this problem is pride, obviously, but teachers who are able to circumnavigate this problem by looking at their teaching and by evolving the way that they teach are truly exceptional teachers. This also pertains to the third aspect of the conceptual framework, which I will get into later. But for now, we'll go to the second aspect of the conceptual framework, and this is that teachers should have a profound understanding of their learners and learning. This is where teachers' flexibility is absolutely of the utmost importance. In building a teaching community, the 2 speakers mention that even though students may speak, they may not necessarily listen. They must listen and hear to foster the best learning environment. Additionally, related to that, it doesn't matter how well material is taught if it isn't ready to be received. For this reason, flexibility in lesson plans is a necessity to get maximum student engagement. Again, this relates back to how I didn't exactly cater to my mostly Hispanic audience, mostly white audience. That probably would have made the lesson a little bit more engaging for the students. Other aspects that Scapp and Hook address include body language and valuing the opinions of a student. Ms. Hook recalls a particular moment when a student told her, "You taught us to think critically, but no one in our other classes values our voice." Caring for what a student has to say could be the difference could be the difference of whether or not they care about the class and care about learning and care to build a foundation for future years of education. So this is an absolutely vital aspect of teaching that every teacher should be aware of. As for the body language, Hook and Scap discuss how it has an immense effect on the way students perceive a lesson. With body language, a teacher not only communicates an urgency for students to be engaged in a lesson, but they also command the room and they dictate their authority. That also relates to how teachers sometimes dress a little bit differently than they might when they're not. Intellectual capital pertains to other things that relate to understanding your learners and learning. One of the main ideas in that passage is that it takes money to make money, and in the same way, it takes knowledge to make knowledge. E.D. Hirsch even references Matthew, the book of the Bible, Matthew 13:12, where it says, "To the one who has, more will be given, and to the one who has not, more will be taken away." All this ultimately culminates to the idea of the learning gap. So the learning gap is basically this idea that if you have a base set of knowledge, that's what you're going to use to continue building. And if you have a lower base set of knowledge, like this red dot right here, you are not going to be able to build as well a foundation for things that are coming. So this, you will learn at a rate that is maybe a little bit lower compared to this blue dot. Now, this blue dot represents someone who has a very strong foundation for what's to come, and as a result, they can build upon that when they learn new subjects and then use that new knowledge to build upon even more. And so they end up learning at a much better rate, and they know more, usually by the end of their high school careers, and onwards through college and so on. And the concept of equality of educational opportunity, James Coleman finds that the environment that a student grows up in, their home setting, plays too significant a role in a student's life for what a student learns to be solely from the school. So by saying this, Coleman is essentially implying that no matter how good a school is, a student whose at-home environment is not the healthiest will probably struggle more than someone who has a healthy home environment. Hirsch relates this back, Hirsch expands on Coleman's idea by saying that psychological research has shown that the ability to learn something new depends on an ability to accommodate the new thing to the already known. A simple example of this is that when cars came around in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people started calling them a horseless carriage. They weren't familiar with this new machine, so they related it back to the former system of transportation that they already knew. So if at a student's home, the innate curiosity that we're born with isn't nourished and it's not really an educational environment, then that student is more likely to have a less powerful experience in school. And the contrary is also true. That if you live in a house that does foster education, then you're probably going to have a better learning experience in school. This whole idea that it takes knowledge to make knowledge also can be applied to a community setting. Another main idea of intellectual capital, Hirsch says that for effective classroom learning to take place, class members need to share enough common reference points to enable all students to learn steadily, albeit at different rates and in response to varied approaches. That is just to say that in community, people talk and educate each other. And so when the community knows more, there's more for the community to learn. One of my favorite quotes of the entire class comes from Education as a Necessity of Life, and it talks about community and communication in common. It says, "There's more than a verbal tie between the words common, community, and communication. Men live in a community in virtue of the things which they have in common, and communication is the way in which they come to possess things in common. What they must have in common in order to form a community or society are aims, beliefs, aspirations, knowledge, a common understanding, like-mindedness, as the sociologists say. All communication is educative. So that sort of wraps up the main ideas of intellectual capital and the main ideas of understanding your learner. The final aspect of the framework that I'm going to address is the conception of what it is to be a teacher. Like, how does that affect your role in the community, and why are teachers always evolving their practice and stuff like that? Central Park East, an alternative story by Deborah Meyer, is perhaps the epitome of what it means to be a teacher and to truly care about students and to leave a lasting impact on them. It's essentially the story of how 4 public schools in New York kind of have to hit the reboot button, and so teachers are given the opportunity to take lead of the school. And what they do with it turns out to be very effective for the students. This whole system is focused on a democratic community of teachers and teacher autonomy. It has an emphasis on parent advice, although not parent control. They strive for an environment where kids nourish just the insatiable passion to know that we're all born with. They claim that their success can be replicated, and they say how with 2 different quotes. Firstly, the secret is wanting it badly enough. The second is that the passion of an amateur and the competence of a professional thrive. Of course, this wasn't the whole story. Part of the reason they were able to implement all the ideas that they had was because this was such a strange happenstance where the teachers were given almost full autonomy over the schools. We Want It All by John Goodlad sort of touches on how there's not a good enough relationship between policymakers and teachers. Goodlad coldly puts it, policymakers worry about statistics, parents and teachers worry about their children. It happens to be that the curriculum in a lot of places is very vague and ambiguous, and what that results in is just completely different, unstandardized systems of teaching. And so kids know different amounts of things when they go from school to school, and even class to class as well. Goodlad proposes that the state needs to step up its role in education, clearly defining any given curriculum. He says they should use honest representative data to analyze where the students of a certain district are. Lastly, Goodlad emphasizes that policymakers need to be committed to implementing whatever curriculum they set forth. No wishy-washy going back on what you said. It needs to be enforced. Hirsch again reemphasizes this in Intellectual Capital, saying specificity of curriculum is more important than avoiding controversy. This is important because the way that I taught the history lesson about American education might be completely different from the way the next teacher addresses it, and maybe the next teacher after that doesn't even address it at all. And so this damages Hirsch's idea in Intellectual Capital that it's beneficial for a community to know collectively and to have a similar basis. In summation, I want to tie this all together by going back to the initial baseline outcome that I did at the beginning of the semester. I essentially summarized what I thought a good teacher was using this flow chart.
I think everything I said on this flow chart is true. However, after the semester, I've learned that it is, in fact, incomplete. So I added a little bit to this box, and then it sort of describes the beginning repertoire as well as a teacher having knowledge of the subject matter. I thought that this little section, it sort of describes about half of what understanding learners and learning should be. And over here, I added a whole new section to the flow chart that addresses the conceptions of the practice of teaching, because I hadn't even considered that in my baseline.
The end result is this much more expansive, much smaller and harder to read flowchart. I have sent a copy to your inbox. But yeah, this is everything that an exceptional teacher does, according to the conceptual framework, Peabody's conceptual framework. The last part of my initial baseline was another flowchart that was much more concise, and I do stand by it still right now. And this is that a superior teacher leaves a truly positive impact on students by inspiring them, making them passionate, and teaching the student how to be a better learner. These are the things that I hope to embody when I go into the teaching world, and eventually I want to go to administration and inspire other teachers to teach in this way that leaves a lasting impact on students and truly compels them to do good and to figure out what their life is about. I want to close with just a few quick quotes that I think really encompass the idea of what it means to be a teacher. From Building a Teaching Community, hard work and joy can coincide in a classroom. Also from Building a Teaching Community, and somewhat paraphrased, being a teacher is being with people. Not recognizing this fact is a travesty that's all too common today. Finally, I want to go back to that quote from Education as a Necessity of Life. All teaching is communicative. I've been a teacher since I could talk, since I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. My peers, my mentors, my mentees have all been teachers at some point in their life. I just think it's a really beautiful, cyclical profession. And as my favorite teacher, Mr. Davidson, once said, if you're not living, I messed that up. He said, if you're not learning, you're dying. And so with that, it's an awesome class. I'm excited to see what the future holds for me in terms of education.